This is another brief chapter on climate change communication. This topic is very broad. In fact, I have a number of podcasts under a chapter on my course called Bending the Curve, where I've included much more material. Here, since we are doing a course on climate change and human health, we will try to add a few points about health risk communication, but it turns out that overall the communication still comes down to climate change and climate change impacts. There are some nice papers, in fact, that include these people. Pigeon and Fishoff from 2011 is a good example. Most of the ideas come down to the language issues where people climate scientists, for example, use terminologies like uncertainty about future projections or past climates, about the cause attribution to specific weather events, and they use terms like bias, where the models are biased compared to the observations, which has to be accounted for when you do weather predictions, climate predictions, and climate projections, and so on. But these terminologies can be misinterpreted or understood as deficiencies or lack of scientific understanding by the general public. So there is that idea that we have to modify our language to reach people. But of course, the biggest problem, as it turns out, is that it's not the knowledge deficit that's always preventing people from accepting climate change. It turns out that people practice rational ignorance, where they may know that human activities are causing changes, but because the change is slow and because it doesn't affect everybody the same way, and because global warming creates winners and losers, people may just want to ignore, or there are vested interests like energy companies who have played very effectively to confuse people about whether greenhouse gas increases are responsible for climate change and whether heat waves and floods. Germany just got flooded, 100 people dead, massive damage, and it's pretty clear with attribution it can be shown that this is exacerbated by climate change. It's a 1 in 1,000 year event that has happened, which means this may now happen more often, and so on. So these are kind of ideas are also opposed by many politicians who may not believe in climate change, or they may be getting contributions from energy companies, and so on and so forth. Okay, so start with from the book's table, 10 principles of climate change communication. Put yourself in your audience's shoes. These are the principles here, and these are some examples of practical consideration. Consider who your audience trusts and respects. Can any of these individuals help deliver climate change communication? So it turns out that many times scientists are not necessarily the best. It could be their priest, it could be a community organization they belong to, a social club, and so on and so forth. And legitimacy, credibility, and salience of the message turn out to be very important factors as well. Channel the power of groups. So which of the values your audience's existing groups align with climate solutions? So they may believe from religious perspective that God is in charge and we are not supposed to be the stewards of the environment. So how do you play with that kind of a religious groups? What climate solutions may fit into their belief that already exists and is pretty strong, and so on. Emphasize solutions and benefits. So alarmist messages are causing climate anxiety and fight or flight response, or freeze response, and so on. So one has to be careful about the message and what its impact is, whether people just feel helpless. Emphasizing solutions and benefits can lead to highlighting the local, personal, and wider benefits of climate solutions, including improving health, which is what we are worried about here. Bring climate impacts close to home. So if you keep talking about what's happening in the polar oceans and polar bears and Antarctic glaciers and so on, people may not connect, but local, personal, people do identify better with locally and personally relevant impacts of climate change, what is happening in your backyard, which may not always be possible, but may be possible in many cases, like coastal impacts, cyclones coming in, bringing higher storm surges and inundations, or extreme events, droughts, heat waves, and so on. Connect climate change to issues that matter to your audience. Draw attention to the connections between climate change and health, such as risks from heat-related illnesses. This is now becoming more and more possible, especially even in parts of Canada and US where people may be skeptical, as we will see. Use images and stories to make climate change real. So narratives matter, how you communicate the science. Use images that depict people or households rather than landscapes and bar charts. So show the impact on people and neighborhoods and landscape and households. Make climate science meaningful. Incorporate real-life comparisons to help contextualize information and connect any statistics used to authoritative messengers. So who is the person? Does the person have credibility and salience and legitimacy among the group you're dealing with? Approach skepticism carefully. I will show an example of why people may have legitimate reasons to wonder about this relation between greenhouse gases and global warming. Consider emphasizing solutions to climate change, principle 3 here, rather than countering the facts with facts and figures. So when somebody is being skeptical, don't start shouting about how CO2 is increasing and how solid that data is and how extremes are increasing, but talk about solutions instead, which may bring co-benefits that even the worst of the skeptics or even those who believe that global warming is a conspiracy may accept, like green economy bringing new jobs, for example, cleaner air, cleaner water. Okay, make behavior change easy. Illustrate positive actions that other people are taking in the audience's community. Peer pressure, it turns out, does work. For example, at some point, if polluting becomes a stigma like smoking, then maybe there will be a tipping point in behavior change. But while communicating, one has to be also aware. Are you communicating to inform people, to get them to participate in action, or are you actually trying to get them to change behavior? Changing behavior is a big step, and there are all sorts of things like one action bias. For example, a person may buy a hybrid car and think they have done their job, but it turns out that, as I mentioned before, a person who drives a hybrid car but eats a lot of meat may have a bigger carbon footprint than a person who's driving an SUV but is a vegetarian. So we have to have a portfolio of things we do to keep our carbon footprint to a minimum. Okay. Finally, why is there a legitimate reason that people may be skeptical? So here is the carbon dioxide increase, the seasonal cycle of photosynthesis during spring, and then leaves falling in the fall winter months is taken out, and CO2 is a long-lasting, well-mixed gas. We can easily measure it precisely and accurately at many places and get this trend very accurately, whereas the energy that's trapped because of these increased CO2 and other greenhouse gases goes into the ocean, goes into evaporating water from land and ocean, goes into melting glaciers. Ocean can store the energy. Ocean takes up 93% of the excess energy trapped by greenhouse gases, and so on. So the temperature doesn't change monotonically just because CO2 increases monotonically, or greenhouse gases increase monotonically. So you have these ups and downs because there are still things like El Nino and La Nina which can release the energy from the ocean temporarily and put it in the ocean temporarily. But what is obvious now is that each decade is warmer than the previous decade. So if you run a smooth 10-year running mean, then we will see that each year is getting more warm than the previous decade globally. But this still can be a problem because global warming is, nobody lives in a global mean temperature. So we still need to worry about what is happening in people's backyards and make that relevant to them, especially communicating the point that even if global warming is happening, we will have winter storms that are extreme because of, let's say, the jet stream wobbling more, because the Arctic ice maybe is disappearing because of Arctic warming and Arctic amplification. So these kind of complicated ideas need to be communicated, as well as the impacts in your backyard and the ultimate connection to health outcomes, which is our main goal here. Okay, so let me come back and make a few more points in the next podcast, but I hope you realize how complicated this business of communicating climate change science is, climate impact, and then climate impact on human health, right? So we have to be aware of all these issues.